The royal atrium of Thalrin Prime was built to make visitors feel small. A canyon of crystal ribs and singing bronze where constellations were caught and tamed in chandeliers. And yet the only smallness on display that night came from the suitors. They arrived lacquered and perfumed, their scales etched with lineage and victories no one asked them to fight. And one by one, they made the long walk beneath the violet banners, bowed to the emperor, and let their eyes slide, just for a heartbeat, over the dais where Princess Velthara sat. She was vast and magnificent, silver scales glimmering beneath storm-colored silks, bracelets carved from meteor bone tinkling softly whenever she shifted, a moon in a room of pebbles, and their faces arranged themselves into the polite horror of men who feared gravity only when it asked something of them. Each petition began with flattery and ended with a clause so thin you could see the contempt through it. Concerns about succession, about optics, about the strain of crown and ceremony, the kind of concern that wore a smile while it measured a woman like cargo. The emperor's counselors recorded refusals with neat stylus strokes, as if cruelty were an administrative task, and the musicians kept playing because that was what they had been paid to do. And by the time the third prince of the Porphyry marches claimed a sudden allergy to gold, even the torches seemed embarrassed by the room. Velthara kept her back straight and her breath even, counting the ironwork arches across the ceiling like prayer beads, refusing the old, learned reflex to fold inward and become less visible than the shame being offered to her. And when the last suitor mumbled something about dynastic symmetry, she let her gaze pass over him, like sunrise passing over a stone, and then looked away, as if to confirm that there were, in fact, other horizons. Later, when the hall emptied and the perfumed draught settled, she stepped alone onto the moon balcony, where the palace opened to the cold, unflinching night. Thalrin's twin moons hung low and heavy, one pearl, one bruised amethyst, and the city below murmured its honest noises, steam vents sighing, tram cables singing, market shutters complaining themselves shut. She set her hands on the balustrade and felt the stone answer. Mass recognizes mass, and it steadied her when the courtier's pretty arithmetic could not. In the glass of the balcony doors her reflection was too large for the frame, and therefore truer than any portrait the royal painters had produced. Shoulders like fortresses, a throat that could carry song over an army, a body that had withstood 1,000 whispered verdicts and was tired of being tried. She wondered, not for the first time, what it would be like to be wanted without conditions, to be a choice rather than an obligation, or a dare. And the wondering didn't hurt, not exactly. It felt like breathing into a bruise to see how much room was left. Somewhere inside the palace, the emperor argued with his advisors in voices polished to edges, and somewhere outside it, a storm rehearsed itself on the horizon. And Velthara stood between the two, practiced at weathering both, and told herself in a voice she trusted that gravity was not an apology. When the final torches in the atrium guttered and the chandeliers dimmed to star salt, she lifted her chin toward the moons, and with a composure the court mistook for pride, decided to meet the next day upright. Mourning did not cleanse the court of its pettiness. It merely put a brighter polish on it. Servants dragged fragrant sands across the marble to erase the footprints of last night's retreating courage, and a new queue of hopefuls formed beneath the lintel, as if the problem had been the hour rather than the men. What entered instead, announced by the simple sound of boots that had known mud, not lacquer, was a human, Terran military issue by the cut of the faded armor and the careful way he watched the edges of a room. Darren Holt paused at the threshold and took in the cathedral of disdain like a battlefield, noting the sightlines, the exits, the way the nobles arranged themselves in crescents sharp enough to cut. And then he saw her, and the soldier in him, the spine that had stood under fire and over wounded men, melted into something softer and more dangerous than bravery. He knelt because his mother had taught him that reverence has nothing to do with rank, and when he looked up his eyes held none of the aversion Velthara had learned to expect and deflect. They held inventory and wonder, and the kind of relief a mechanic feels when he realizes the part everyone else calls a flaw is the reason the machine can carry weight. The court laughed on schedule, brittle and synchronized, jokes about stray marines and lower standards orbiting the dice like gnats. But their noise arrived to Darren's ears the way distant artillery does when you are already in the trench doing the work that will decide who crawls out. "Your Highness," he said, and his voice didn't crack on the title because he wasn't using it to flatter. He was fitting the right word to the right person with the competence of a man who had learned that the correct name for a thing is the first tool you reach for. She tilted her head the slightest degree, enough to let him know she had noticed the absence of fear, the refusal to rehearse contempt, this human's decision to be here without apology, and in that small exchange the air around them thickened with option. Protocol required he address the Emperor next, and he did. Plain as a field report. He stated name, rank, and station, the battles he had survived because he believed in becoming the shield that breaks, not the sword that boasts. And then, without pomp, without flourish, with the uncluttered audacity of a man who has already decided to live with what he is about to say, he asked permission to speak his intention. "I have crossed worlds where beauty is rationed like air," he said, gaze never leaving Velthara's, "and I have found none so generous as the gravity in your daughter's presence. Where I come from, we propose to what holds." The atrium pinged with scandal like hail on a roof. Counselors scrambled for a rule to forbid him. Minor princes found a sudden interest in their gloves, and the Emperor's face set into the expression men use when they are considering whether surprise is more useful than rage. Velthara did not move, but the light seemed to move on her, sliding over every curve as if to underline the sentence he'd just spoken. And in the quiet that followed, the human reached for words he didn't think he'd ever say in a room like this, and found them waiting, unafraid of polished floors. "I'm here to propose, Majesty," Darren said, warmth and grit braided in his tone. "Not to the crown, to her." And the court, discovering that there are silences that make men taller and others that make them smaller, fell into the latter, while the princess, whose life had been scored in rejections, felt the first true chord of a new song settle against her ribs. The rumor of a human proposal moved through Thalrin Prime with the velocity of a pressure leak. First a hiss inside corridors, then a shriek in council chambers, finally a palpable change in the air, as if the palace itself were holding its breath. Petitioners withdrew their gifts so they could claim they had never offered them. Poets sharpened their couplets against a man they had not met. The Emperor's advisors produced scrolls full of ancient reasons a daughter could be praised, and a more ancient list of reasons she could be refused. None of it touched the one person it meant to cage. Velthara walked the morning galleries bareheaded, scales catching the sun like wet stone, and the court, trained to stare through her as if she were a decorative mountain, found themselves staring at her the way people stare when a storm they have dismissed decides to arrive. Darren Holt was given guest quarters that looked like a lacquered version of an armory, and told, with a diplomat's smile, that a Marine should feel at home among weapons. He unstrapped his chest plate on the balcony and breathed the thin, clean air of a world that had perfected heights. From here, the city was an orchestra of bridges and lifts and wind vanes. Below him, gravity plates sang their low metallic hymn as freight stepped from sky to stone. He knew what the court thought of him, portable scandal, imported embarrassment, but the old field calm had returned and would not leave. He had proposed because the room had told him a lie, and he was tired of rooms that did that. The aftermath would be logistics. Marines live on logistics. He was summoned to the Hall of Verification at noon, a chamber so polished that words slid off it. The Emperor did not wear a crown. He wore effortlessness, the heavier ornament. "Human," he said, dismissing the name he had been given, "do you propose a spectacle or conviction?" Darren's boots had left a faint grit on the immaculate floor. He did not apologize for it. "Conviction is what you have when spectacle stops helping," he said. "Majesty, I'm here because your daughter held her ground under a sky of laughing men and still made the room bigger. Well, I am asking to share the weight she carries." "Weight," one counselor repeated with a smile sharp enough to open an artery, "is what breaks bridges." Darren turned his head and looked past the dice to the far windows where the weighing bridge curved between two towers. a long arc of alloy that recalibrated the city's grav plates every morning at 10. "Not if the bridge is built for what it bears," he said. Something unreadable passed through the Emperor's gaze, a weather front considering where to rain. "You will observe a truce," the old man said at last. 30 days, no exile, no acceptance. You may speak and walk and be seen. We will learn what your presence does." The chamber's scribes wrote the truce into the living ledger carved along the base of the wall. The stone took the words and warmed, as if pleased to be used honestly for once. Valthara met him that evening in the Aurora Gallery, where 100 mirrors held 100 false versions of her, and the setting sun refused to choose among them. She did not ask him to repeat himself. She asked him how he had come to live with a spine full of stubbornness. He told her about mud and first aid, and the day he understood that the right words could lower a temperature. She told him about tutors who taught her to be less, with the precision of surgeons. "They call it poise," she said with a half-smile that did not sign a treaty with bitterness. "I suspect it was camouflage." He reached into the pocket behind his breastplate and brought out a ring he had made the way mechanics make apologies, quietly, with his hands. It was a narrow band hammered from a fallen hull washer, edges burnished smooth, inlaid with a thread of star wire that caught light only when it wanted to. "For when the truce ends," he said, "if you want it to." She turned it in her fingers and saw the thing he was offering, not a symbol larger than a life, but a life with room for symbols. The truce did what truce does when it is not allowed to be an excuse. They walked the city. On the weighing bridge, she felt the plates adjust to their combined mass, the alloy singing a lower note, and he grinned as if music had just learned a better key. In the market quarter, people watched the way he angled his body to make space for her in tight aisles without making a spectacle of it. A child in a baker's apron handed her a cinnamon roll as if paying a debt he did not yet have the words for. Inevitably, a noble tried a test designed in a room that had never seen a street. "If your love is strength," the man said loudly at the base of the fealty steps, "carry her." Darren examined the staircase, a long flight of narrow, treacherous risers meant to humble anyone who forgot where they were going. He knelt and placed his palms on the first step. "I don't carry thrones," he said, voice level. "I brace them." He bent his back and made of himself a landing. Valthara put her foot on him and climbed. The noble, who had expected a circus and found a liturgy, discovered that on certain days the only applause comes from a city deciding to keep its dignity. Not all the provocations were public. A minister offered Darren a viper-thin stipend and a fast ship to anywhere luminous if he would rescind his proposal, for the good of mutual respect. A younger lord challenged him to a duel, confident that a Terran who had learned to fight in cramped alleys and trenches would be undone by the formal dance of court combat. Darren refused the money and won the duel by disarming rather than bleeding, then offered the blade back hilt first. "I don't need your throat to prove anything," he said. Someone in the galleries laughed, not the cruel kind, the human kind that escapes when the poem finally lands on its feet. When the 30th day drew near, the emperor sent for them again, not to banish or bless, but to invoke something old that had outlived most of the empire's habits. "You think in metaphors of bridges," he told Darren without malice. "We temper partners by bridges here too." He named the bearing stone, a flywheel sunk in the plaza beneath the skygate, a device as ceremonial as it was mechanical. To free the gate at dawn, the stone must be turned by hands, not engines. It had not yielded to a single bearer in centuries. "If you can start it," the emperor said, eyes on both of them now, "you may finish your sentence in public." It was both trap and invitation. Darren bowed to the old machine he had not yet seen. Valthara set her jaw in the expression the court had mistaken for vanity, and which was, in fact, promise. Dawn found the plaza full. Workers with coffee on their breath, nobles wrapped against the hour's honesty, an old woman holding a string of prayer keys she had no intention of using if the sight would do. The bearing stone crouched at the plaza's heart like a patient animal, 9 rings locked together around a central axis, its grip pedestals smoothed by the hands of people long dead. Darren stripped off his chest plate and flexed sore fingers that had tightened tourniquets more than they had ever lifted weights. Velthara wrapped her palms in linen and grease. "We pull together," he said, not as motto, as instruction, and the two of them set their hands to the iron while the city, having spent a lifetime snickering at metaphors, prepared to learn one. Chapter 4. The Stone That Turned. The first truth the bearing stone told them was that tradition weighs more than metal. The rings refused to budge, as if insulted by the very idea of change. Beneath their palms, the iron felt less like matter than like memory. A record of the 1,000 times pride had outlasted need. Darren adjusted his grip and widened his stance. "Breathe like we did on the stairs," he said, knowing that in the end, every act of strength is a conversation with air. Velthara exhaled through her teeth and sank her weight into her heels. Muscles built to be hidden declared themselves. The stone groaned, not movement yet, but attention. The second truth was that the body listens when it trusts the voice giving it orders. He marked time aloud, marine calm, as the sun pulled color out of the stonework. 4-count inhale, 2-count hold, 6-count push. At the count of 6, he shifted, not more force but better leverage, and the resistance changed texture from old stubborn to recently persuadable. A child on her father's shoulders clapped once without knowing why, and was shushed by a mother who did know why and wanted to hold the moment still. The third truth arrived like a drumbeat crossed with a cathedral bell. Deep inside the apparatus, somewhere beyond the reach of oil and logic, something decided it had been argued with correctly. The outer ring moved a fraction, a hiccup, a rumor, and the plaza heard it as a syllable. Velthara adjusted her footing the way a dancer does when she insists a floor remember it is, in fact, a partner. Darren reached with one hand, kept pressure with the other, and tapped the ring's rim with the heel of his palm at the exact place where stubbornness had stored itself. The sound resonated up his arm. The bearing found a cleaner channel. The stone turned. It did not become easy. It became inevitable. The effort carved itself into both their faces, but neither postured, and perhaps that was what most unsettled the gallery. No swagger, no theatrical groan, only the clean mechanics of two bodies adding to a problem until the problem had to include them in its solution. Sweat jeweled Velthara's brow. Darren's forearm shook in ragged harmonics with the rings. Together they found a rhythm that machines recognize before crowds do. The old woman with the prayer keys stopped counting and began to smile. At 1/4 turn, the Skygate's locking struts sighed and lifted a hand's breadth. At 1/2, the wind changed its mind about how to move through the plaza. At 3/4, something in the Emperor's posture, more weather than man, softened, and those closest to him pretended not to notice. The last quarter required a bargain. The stone gave them a moment of slack and then demanded exactness. Darren fixed his eyes on a gouge in the iron the size of a coin. Velthara fixed hers on the shadow of his thumb. They pushed through the last resistance and felt the axis tremble into alignment. The gate shivered like an instrument retuned. Light broke along the hinges in a clean, astonished line. The plaza did not cheer immediately. The sound it made was stranger and more useful, a collective exhale that revised a city's vocabulary. Then the applause came, uncoached and asymmetric, starting in the workmen clustered near the freight lifts, jumping to the baker's crew who had come to see if rumor could sweeten dough, leaping up the tiers until even the nobles had to decide whether they preferred to be excluded or changed. The Emperor stepped forward to the balcony rail, not a conqueror, just a father who had run out of ways to disguise his education. He raised one hand, the noise quieted by degrees until words could survive in it. "By our oldest devices," he said, voice carrying in the old honest way, "the gate opens. By hands, not engines." He looked at Darren and did not use the word human as a weapon. By 2 hands, not one. Then he looked at his daughter. He had never seemed small. He did not seem small now, but he seemed specific, and specificity is a kind of humility. "Velthara," he said, and the name, once a badge, sounded like a greeting. Ceremony would have liked to take it from there and smother the morning in incense, but history rarely consults ceremony about pacing. A shriek ripped the new silence. Metal on metal, wrong, and a cargo skiff, its pilot fighting a fried relay, slashed low across the plaza like a blade thrown by a god with bad aim. Instinct drew a diagonal of panic. The crowd broke along its old lines, the poor finding exits first because practice is a teacher, the rich searching for ushers who were busy finding their own feet. Darren moved before thought, stepping between the skiff and the slowest-moving knot of bodies, a cluster of kitchen staff with sacks of flour, and sent his voice ahead like a thrown rope. Down, the skiff's belly scraped the paving. Sparks sheeted. A shard from a buckled stabilizer kissed his ribs hard enough to make white edge the world. Velthara's body learned a trick it had been built for, and never allowed to practice. She covered him with the speed of weather, hooking one hand under the skiff's rail, shoulder under fuselage, legs under the old argument that had been thrown at her since childhood. The skiff tried to complete its wrong sentence. She edited it. Metal screamed, then remembered how to be persuaded. The vehicle juddered to a stop at a mean angle. The operator, red-eyed and shame-shaking, staggered clear. Darren sucked air that tasted of hot alloy and sugar from split flour sacks. "I'm fine," he lied, because Marines lie about that first. "You are not," she said, because some lies deserve to be interrupted, and pressed her palm against the bleeding groove along his side until the red receded from his field of view. The plaza reassembled itself around competence, the way iron filings find a magnet. Porters lifted debris. The baker's crew triaged burns with damp aprons. A court physician arrived late and, seeing the hand that stopped the bleeding, wisely offered bandages instead of commentary. The Emperor's Guard, whose pikes were built for ceremonies and not accidents, discovered the uses of being strong in the right way by copying what they saw. When the skiff had been righted and the worst wounds bound, Darren let Velthara take half his weight because he had already learned what the city was learning, which is that a thing is lighter on two bodies than it is on one. They stood together under the newly opened sky gate as the morning finished arriving. The Emperor descended stone steps that had been designed for triumphs and found they were adequate to contrition. He stopped within reach, close enough to see the grease in Velthara's palm lines, the blood drying at Darren's flank, the flour on everyone's boots. "Tradition kept us from mockery," he said, choosing each word as if it were a component that could strip if forced. "You have reminded us to be useful." He did not declare a wedding. He did not perform a pardon where none had been requested. He turned so the plaza, not the court, could read his face. "Thalrin honors proposals made without cruelty," he announced, "and partnerships that turn our engines." Formality tried once more to assert itself. Scrolls, signatures, a procession reheated from some other century. But the day refused to be repackaged. Darren produced the small ring that had lived near his heart for a month of truce and looked, not at the Emperor, but at the woman who had lifted a skiff easily as she had lifted a sentence off the floor, and set it upright. "Velthara," he said, and the name steadied his hands. "I meant it in the atrium, in the gallery, on the bridge, at the stone, and here with flour on our boots. Will you let me be your brace and your witness and your audience of one when the halls get loud?" She did not pretend to deliberate. She held out her hand, and the ring found its place, and the plaza released a sound people make when the world allows them to keep both hope and work. Later, after the gate had taken its first honest traffic, after the skiff pilot had apologized to everyone and meant it, after the baker had handed them rolls still warm enough to burn fingers, Velthara and Darren stood at the edge of the plaza where the wind learns the new names of streets. The bearing stone spun slowly, satisfied in motion, a machine that had been spoken to correctly. "They will try to turn this into a legend by evening," she said, leaning her shoulder against his, as if testing the weld. "Let them," he answered. "We'll turn it back into a schedule tomorrow." She laughed, low and certain, and the sky gate, which had never cared for poetry, opened a little wider, as if practicality were the most romantic thing it had heard all year. The morning after the gate opened, the city woke with new posture, as if a chiropractor had adjusted stone. Market awnings went up earlier. Tram whistles sounded less like apologies. Even the wind seemed to run its errands instead of scolding the roofs. Darren felt it under his boots on the plaza, an almost musical steadiness in the paving, as he and Velthara made their slow walk beneath the sky gate, to accept the congratulations that a day earlier would have been unthinkable. Bakers pressed hot bread into their hands. A courier bowed without sarcasm. A pair of young guards, embarrassed by their own sentiment, stood a little taller when the princess thanked them for managing the crowd. He told himself to remember every face, because these were the witnesses that mattered, the ones who would retell what happened without gilding it into something useless. The court was less settled. In the high galleries, pearls clustered around whispers, and whispers hardened into a plan built on the oldest conviction of anyone who can't win a fair argument. Break the floor. A faction who called themselves the Porphyry Compact, men who had left the bearing stone unmoved for years, but could lift a rumor with one finger, slipped their agents into the gravplate control room that sat like a steel heart below the weighing bridge. The procession of consent the public walk lovers took to announce an engagement would cross that span at noon. Toggle a few ratios, delay a safety interlock, and suddenly the bridge that had sung a lower note for her mass yesterday would lurch when the pair were halfway across. Panic would do the rest. The compact did not imagine the city would choose them afterward. They simply needed it not to choose anyone else. Darren smelled the wrongness before he heard it. A life in trenches had taught him that sabotage has a tone, a little stutter in the air like a chest about to cough. As they mounted the first slope of the arc, his spine made the small animal decision that saves lives. He touched Velthara's wrist, a pressure, not a command, and said without moving his mouth, "Listen." She tilted her head, and he watched her hearing sharpen the way he had seen it do under load at the bearing stone. The bridge's song was almost true, but under it, a second voice muttered, a hungry calculation in the plate's bass note. He had a half-minute before show became danger. He raised his hands as if to address the crowd, and instead found the foreman of the porters with his eyes. "Lines," Darren called, loud enough to be leadership, not loud enough to be alarm. "Throw down your lines." Porters and trammen reacted on muscle memory older than conspiracy. Coils of rope appeared from satchels and shoulders, and flew like friendly serpents to anchor points that had not been used since the flood 5 winters ago. Velthara stepped to the rail, set both palms on the cold alloy, and sent her weight into the span not to fight it, but to persuade it, the way she had convinced the bearing stone to join the day. The first lurch arrived, a brutish buck of bad math, and when 100 throats sucked air, Darren's voice landed on theirs with the steadiness of a wedge. "Hold the line. Eyes on me." He took the strain on the nearest rope, felt the bridges lie like heat through a wall, and shouted, "Shift left 2 paces, now." The arc obeyed, and not because of rank. People moved as if they had been training for this all their lives without knowing it, and perhaps they had. The plates tried to throw weight downhill, the ropes argued, the princess's hands insisted. The second lurch came larger, a mean joke escalating after a laugh it hadn't earned. A child fell. Darren was there in 3 strides, hands under armpits, rise and plant with the economy of a man who has lifted more bodies than he tells anyone about. Velthara's voice cut through the panic without shouting. "Anchor." The word was not metaphor. She braced her back to the rail and spread herself wide across the motion, making of her body what its makers had never dared let it be in politics, a brace the city could lean on without shame. The bridge bucked once more, found she would not move, and sulked into a wobble. Below, in the control room, a young engineer named Harold, who had grown up on stories of the gate and had never expected to be asked to kneel for a noble's cowardice, stared at the foreign hands rifling his boards, and did the bravest small thing anyone can do. He pulled the manual cutoff that would end his job and, if the city chose wrong, maybe his family's standing. Gravity remembered its covenant with physics. The plate's song corrected itself like a singer who finds the right pitch after a swallowed word. The bridge settled, exhausted and a little ashamed. The compact's plan, built on the hope that crowds love fear, met an obstacle they had forgotten to consider: gratitude. It started in one voice, a dockwoman with flour on her sleeve and rope burns on her palms. "Princess," she called, eyes wet and furious, "Marine." Then another voice, and another, and the air filled with simple names spoken like promises, rather than titles spoken like favors owed. Nobles who had positioned themselves to shepherd the panic toward their conclusions found the panic refusing to be herded. A guard captain shouldered through bodies and reached Darren with a pale face and a clenched jaw. "We have the saboteurs," he said. "Orders?" Darren glanced at Velthara, and for a split instant the world seemed to hang from a single quiet decision. "Let them live long enough to hear what they tried to break still holding," she said. The crowd parted to show the agent's frog marched forward, and the Emperor, who had watched the almost disaster from a balcony where triumph and terror had wrestled for an indecent interval, put a hand on the rail and looked at his city as if asking permission. "We will judge tonight," he said, "not because vengeance is hungry, but because trust is." Harl was brought up blinking into daylight, and when Darren took his grease-smeared hand and raised it, the plaza made the kind of sound that brightens memory for a lifetime. The procession of consent resumed, a little ragged, better for it. On the far side of the span, Velthara paused, breath high in her chest, and looked back across the curve they'd just insisted into sense. "They tried to make me a spectacle," she said, voice pitched for Darren and the 5 people nearest them. "They made us a practice." He grinned, ribs aching, and answered the way he had on the day of the bearing stone. "Schedules beat myths." She laughed, and the gate caught the sound and gave it a little lift, as if to carry it across the city to rooms still deciding what to believe. When evening fell, the Emperor held an open court, thicker with citizens than courtiers, and the compact discovered that scandal is brittle when the floor holds. There were sentences, banishments from offices that had once felt hereditary, restitution paid in days worked on public crews with names instead of titles, a set of public apologies written in ordinary ink, and signed with hands that finally shook for the right reasons. No one cheered the punishments. They cheered the foreman's ropes, the engineer's cutoff, the princess's hands, the human who kept saying hold in a voice that made holding feel like something you could do. And in the long hall where, the night before, portraits had watched, with indifferent paint, someone had draped a single banner over the central arch. Not a crest, just a thick cord knotted at the middle, the ordinary beauty of a thing that doesn't come undone. They refused a wedding that apologized for itself. No masks, no dimming curtains, no parade of foreign cousins who loved treaties more than people. They chose the plaza under the sky gate at dawn, when light arrives without heralds, and set the dice not on a stage, but on the very slab that covered the bearing stone, a reminder that anything worth celebrating should be able to turn an engine if asked. Darren woke before the bell and watched the city pink toward morning from the barracks roof, a cup of bitter tea cooling between his palms. He felt the old battle tightness in his chest, not fear, readiness, the sense that vows like assaults go better when you remember to breathe. Velthara came up the service stair without escorts and stood beside him in a plain sash, the color of stormwater. The scar along her flank, earned on the day a skiff forgot its manners, flashed and then hid beneath the cloth when she breathed. "Are you ready to be everyone's story?" she asked, half teasing, wholly serious. He set the tea down and considered the question with the gentleness it deserved. "I'd rather be your habit," he said. She smiled in that sideways way of hers, the one that had startled courtiers into admitting they had souls, and nodded toward the humming city. "Then let's make the habit official." The plaza had already filled by the time they stepped down from the roof. Bakers leaned from windows. Tram conductors stood at ease for once, chins lifted. Children sat on shoulders, as if inventing a new unit of measure called hope. The Emperor waited at the edge of the slab with the circlet tucked under his arm instead of on his head, a deliberate imperfection that made even his detractors respect him for once. He looked older and better, like a blade finally sharpened for its intended use. "By the law of our motors," he began, then stopped and let the prepared speech find the floor instead of the air. "No, by the sight of our own eyes," he said, louder, and the plaza leaned in. There were no priests. Harel, the engineer, stepped forward with a set of wrenches like an offering and placed 2 in their hands. The foreman of the porters brought a length of new hemp rope, thick, unremarkable, beautiful, and coiled it at their feet. The baker's child presented 2 rings on a scrap of waxed paper, Darren's hull washer band with star wire that chose when to shine, and a twin forged overnight from a bearing race that had been retired with honors, its inner face, polished to a secret brightness that would warm skin when work ran long. The gifts were not symbols pretending to be tools, they were tools permitted to be symbolic for a day. They spoke without poetry and made poetry anyway. Darren took her hands, scales warm, palms calloused by the arguments she'd won with physics, and said, "I vow to pull with you, not at you, to be brace, not burden, to say stop when stopping is wise, and go when the work is good." He swallowed and added, "Because the morning asked for truth without armor, I fell in love at first sight because you did not hide your gravity. I stay in love because you keep using it." Valthara's voice followed, lower, steadier, carrying like the hum of a contented engine. "I vow to give you my weight when the wind wants you, to shift when you need space and lean when you need strength, to call you back to meals when duty forgets your body, and to laugh loudly enough that cruel rooms have to learn a new echo." She slid the bearing ring onto his finger. He slid the washer band onto hers. The plaza inhaled and remembered to exhale as if at a signal. There was a quiet for a heartbeat, the precise size of consent, and then the Emperor lifted the circlet, held it against the light as if checking for hairline fractures, and did something no one could remember a ruler doing. He set it not on a head, but on the lip of the bearing stone's cover. "A crown that can't turn a flywheel is a bracelet," he said. "Let this one rest where it can be reached when something heavy asks for hands." He nodded to Harl, who grinned, and to the foreman, who had already looped the rope through the stone's handholds. "Tradition says a marriage opens the gate," the Emperor continued. "Mechanics say it opens because someone turns the right thing. Let's abuse both truths at once." They pulled together. Bride, groom, emperor, engineer, baker's child, tram conductors, guards with scabbed knuckles, a pair of nobles who discovered to their surprise that linen cuffs could stain with dignity. The stone moved easily, as if glad to be written into this page. The gate shrugged its hinges and lifted for morning traffic. Bells spoke from towers not with pomp, but with the everyday cadence that tells a city when it may start trusting daylight. Valthara looked at Darren over the rope and made the face she reserved for successful repairs. He made the one he reserved for sunrise, after a night that had lasted too long. The feast was not a parade of courses arranged to flatter appetites that had never known hunger. It was tables and benches dragged into the shade, loaves broken with work-blackened hands, stews ladled until pots clinked their empty approval. The Emperor and his counselors ate what everyone else ate, learning with only minor discomfort that conversation isn't a tax you pay to a throne, it's a bridge you build to a neighbor. Children chased each other under banners that suddenly seemed less like warnings and more like colored cloth. The guard captain taught a ring of boys the 3 knots every soul should know. A duelist from the old school blushed and asked the foreman to show him how to throw a line without wasting rope. Darren found himself repeatedly interrupted by people who wanted his opinion on squeaks, leaks, and squealing nephews. Valthara disappeared and reappeared in the tide of bodies like the moon over a quick sea, accepting hugs, telling a grandmother her soup tasted exactly like keeping a promise to a dead man, lifting a tram wheel with a laugh just to prove she could. There were formalities the law required, and they came at last like punctuation. Signatures scratched into a book that remembered better kings and worse. A brief decree from the Emperor inscribing what the city already knew, that proposals offered without cruelty and partnerships proved under load would be honored from this day as precedent, not miracle. A handful of sentences committing the grav plate schematics to public record so that no compact could hide bad math again. No one minded the words. They were the kind that make future arguments shorter. As the sun slid toward the copper roofs, music happened. First from a tram driver's mouth, then from someone's hand on a drum, then from strings that had been tuned in alleys while bread cooled. Darren offered his hand because he had decided never again to let her walk alone into a circle she deserved to own, and on the flagstones where they had once braced against sabotage, they danced. He did not try to lead her into smallness. She did not try to pull him into spectacle. They moved the way the gate opens when the stone has been spoken to correctly, with weight, with grace, with the absence of hurry that tells everyone watching that this is not a performance but a habit they can rely on. When the first stars found their posts, the city thinned to ordinary night. Crews gathered buckets, children were steered toward baths, the baker's child fell asleep, clutching a coil of rope like a toy. Darren and Velthara wandered back to the bearing stone because their feet had learned to end days where useful things begin. He set his palm on the cool metal, she set hers beside it, and the two prints looked like a diagram of a machine that had been improved by love. "Tomorrow," he said, with the exact contentment of a man who wants a tomorrow full of the same. "Tomorrow," she echoed, and the word felt less like a hope than like a schedule. They left the circlet where it sat, reachable. They left the rope coiled and ready. They walked home under the gate, which opened for them, not because they were royal or because it was romantic to do so, but because someone had taken the trouble earlier that day to turn the right thing. And if any legend was being written in that hour, it was being written by a city that had finally remembered how to be an engine, and by two people who had promised, in front of everyone, to keep it running.